Hey guys, this is Sarah's Night, and I thought, kind of before moving forward with the next Let's Read, next LP, which on that one is probably going to be Deadly Premonition, as you might have heard me comment in the last LP episode that I did on The Evil Within 2. Yeah, totally looking forward to that. Um, I just kind of got a spontaneous idea to make a video sort of summarizing what I thought of each of the Bunnicula books that we went through. The original series anyway. I'm not going to be including Howie and Moreau and the Doghouse of Doom on that because, well, that was a spin-off and, wasn't that great. But kind of going over the pros and cons that I can think of. Maybe not necessarily cons, but things that I think could have been improved upon in each of those books. Giving them a certain score, maybe a letter grade, because like I do with video games, if you've ever talked to Lantis, he'll probably tell you his frustrations with my particular system of scoring video games on a scale of 1 to 10, and also having like a letter grade that doesn't seem to match with it and stuff. But this is probably going to be pretty informal, ranking the videos from, 1, the absolute best, to 7, the least best. And I didn't really... I thought of things to say, which, gave me the idea for the video in the first place, but it's not like I wrote them down, and I'm going to read off a script. So this is going to be pretty informal. I might stumble over my words a lot, but I thought it'd be worth doing so. Hopefully you will enjoy hearing me kind of go on about the books one last time for a while before finally hanging it up for good. So let's start with number 7. So, number 7, you probably would have guessed this one. It's natural for longtime fans of any kind of series of fiction, video games, books, movies, to actually rank one of the modern ones, if not the most modern sequel, to be the worst of the bunch or the least best. But this was actually I was actually seriously considering the book that I have in number 6 to be number 7 instead of this one. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean I hate Bunnicula meets Edgar Allan Poe by any means. It's still a good book, at least pretty good. It's just I think there's a certain bias that I have against it. I wasn't able to, because I read it as an adult, because it came out so late, that in Bunnicula Strikes Again so much later after the first 5 books, that reading it as an adult, I couldn't look at it with that same childish sense of wonder for, hopefully you know what it is I'm trying to speak of here. It's really hard to look at it in the same way that I did the first 5 books that I read as a child. Just not the same sense of wonder. But there are still good things about it. I guess I will kind of go ahead and start off with the bad. It's no disrespect intended to the editor, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name. I know I at least addressed all the editors together. Not the editor, sorry, the illustrator. No disrespect intended to the illustrator of Edgar Allan Poe. He obviously wasn't the same person as any of the previous books. But I just really did not like the pictures very much at all in this book, the way they were drawn. And I don't know, I just again, looking at it as an adult, I can't see it the same way I did as a child, where I am more easily impressed by things, easily awestruck. I just didn't like that. It didn't really get a grip on the atmosphere or the scenery that I think the book was trying to convey. These illustrations just didn't work out for me, especially with Miles Tanner himself, pretty much the main character, or the main antagonist anyway. Like you probably saw me say in the commentary, the summary underneath one of the Let's Read videos for Edgar Allan Poe, that he reminds me of the friggin' Chainsaw Maniac off of that Tiny Toons movie, which everybody will hopefully know who is about my age, early 30s. They will know what I'm talking about. That Tiny Toons movie, How I Spent My Summer Vacation, the friggin' chainsaw murderer, a psychopath, that gets into Hampton's family's car with Plucky Duck, and Plucky seems to only seems to be the only one who knows, like, who senses that anything is wrong. This dude is like revving up a chainsaw right in the back seat with a hockey mask on. But yeah, just that cartoonishly long face and the droopy expression. I don't know. I guess you could say it's right in that it conveys that Miles Tanner is obviously a freak. Something is off about him. And it's one of those things where on one hand, yet again, I can't really blame Chester for flipping out and thinking something is wrong with this dude, under the circumstances. But it's not like, and that's the only major gripe, if you can even call it that I have with Edgar Allan Poe. Again, all these books are dang near fantastic, if not beyond that. I did like the fact that this is actually, you would normally think this is a negative, but I actually did like the fact that this isn't really part of the overarching plot. The first 6 books was pretty much just Chester versus Bunnicula. Either Bunnicula was the main antagonist, or was more of a monster of the week thing, at least in the midst of that, like with Holiday Inn and Nighty Nightmare, where Chester, Harold, and Howie were up against a different kind of, potentially, evil plot or force, but Bunnicula was still at the center of it, essentially. It's just that I actually did like the fact that this book, unlike the first 6, was kind of an after story to that. The main conflict is over. At the end of Bunnicula Strikes Again, as you saw, Chester actually completely changed his tune, did a complete 180, and became friends with Bunnicula, even to the point where he is actually protective of him. And that is the plot of Edgar Allan Poe. Chester is actually protecting Bunnicula against the evil that he perceives. Mistakenly, but again, with Miles Tanner, all that we learned about him, you really got to kind of wonder, if he has a hidden psychopath within him, and I kind of don't blame Chester too much on one hand for seeing it that way. So, it's like a nice little kind of comedic after story. Now that everything is back to normal, the main conflict is resolved and all that. I actually do appreciate that. I appreciate that James Howell gave it just, one more try at the pen, and he came out with a good one. So, I guess if there is a slightly, I'm not going to call it another con, it's like the illustrations, but I guess I would have preferred that this didn't take place so much in the Monroe household. They never even leave the house, really. I think Bunnicula actually gets out and runs around for a while, but that's off-screen. Harold and Chester barely even walk out of the house. So, Howie doesn't either. And this pretty much takes place entirely inside the house, and that's pretty much like the first Bunnicula, other than the point towards the end of the book where they were at the vet's office, and that's where the conflict was kind of resolved. A little bit off-screen too, so to speak. I guess I would have preferred that this. It would have been nice to actually see some of the time, maybe for Harold, Chester, and Howie to end up at the school like the Monroes and Pete in particular, to see the assembly or speech, whatever it was, where Miles Tanner was going to be speaking at Pete's school. It would have been nice if they kind of crashed the party on that instead of it happening in the house towards the end, where the whole entire truth is revealed about Miles Tanner. Of course, off the top of my head, I don't know exactly how that should go. I'm not James Howell. I'm not a brilliant writer like him. I'm just saying that's probably I would have liked to see something like that. But I do like the way that it ended overall. The fact that this has nothing to do with Bunnicula towards the end, that still makes sense. That's totally fine. Because again, main conflict of Chester versus Bunnicula, who he perceives to be a vampire, and has, way more devious intentions than just draining the juices out of vegetables. So Chester fancies himself saving the world here, or at least the entire town of Centerville from turning into vampires or something, and covering, all the land in darkness. It's totally fine that the ending barely even had anything to do with Bunnicula. I actually did like the fact that Miles Tanner, for as much of a weirdo as he is, he actually found love. And it almost seemed like love at first sight with Miss Pickles, the school librarian. It was nice that she actually became just some random faculty member from Pete's school. Actually is pretty heavily involved in the story, shows up for probably a good third of it. And that she and Miles kind of had a spontaneous romance, and at the end it was them getting together, kind of at the at the whim of Edgar Allan Poe, who rightfully is like Miles Tanner's muse, but he has to let him go. But it's like Edgar Allan Poe does this does this one last good deed for his owner before he flies off back into the wild and leaves Miles behind forever. And I did like the fact that instead of taking Bunnicula away to help Miles overcome his fear of Miles being scared of domesticated animals, that was just silly. But it does work into the fact that kind of help him overcome his fears. Miles had all those stuffed animals, and he also asked, politely under the circumstances, even though it's definitely off the wall favor to ask, is for Bunnicula, and the fact that you actually need to give Bunnicula away on that. Instead, Kyle and Pete had the idea of giving one of Bunnicula's sons instead to Miles. Is like, is that a good enough substitute? And Miles Tanner is like, yeah, that'd be great. It was also kind of interesting because kind of punches me in the face out of nowhere. I totally forgot that Bunnicula was ever raised for a period of time by Pete's neighbor and friend Kyle, and it's like, oh wow, Bunnicula got it on with a female bunny. That's just not the kind of thing you would imagine him doing, but evidence is right there. Had a whole litter of rabbits, and thankfully none of them turned out to be vampires. Much to Chester's disappointment, I imagine, so he could kind of do another about face and go on his vampire slaying sprees again heroically. But I did like that ending. I thought it was good, and just as always, this is probably one of the best books when it comes to the editor's note portions. We actually had a final farewell from the editor and like this pseudo biography of Harold and Howie. Howie became a writer too of the lesser good Tales from the House of Bunnicula books, and he probably wrote some others that I don't know about. And of course, Harold, the writer of all the original Bunnicula books himself. I really did like that was included in this last book as kind of a final farewell. And this was editor's note portions in all of the books have always been almost as entertaining as the story itself. That's quite an accomplishment, and it's really no less here in Edgar Allan Poe. So that's another positive. And finally, I would like to say that I really got to give props to R.L. Stine, who is clearly being parodied here in the form of Empty Graves in his Flesh Crawlers books. James Howe did it pretty well, making fun of R.L. Stine. I really got to say, Stine must be a cool guy. Look back, I read the Goosebumps books as a child, just like 90% of the other kids my age. They were really popular at the time. I don't even know how far R.L. Stine went into that. I think he made it like past number 60 in the regular series. I maybe quit somewhere around 50, and he had like several other spin-offs of Goosebumps. He had like the Choose Your Own Adventure type books on that, and then like a Goosebumps 2000, maybe at the turn of millennium, I suppose, he wrote more books like the Goosebumps books, and I read a few of those. I remember now vaguely. I read a few of those, and it was like kind of stepping up on a little bit on the scares and the seriousness of the situation in each of those books. Yeah, you look back on them and you're like, they're nostalgic, but most of them really were dumb if you tried to look at them objectively. But you know what? That's cool. He wrote schlock, but you know, it worked for us at the time, and you really got to give him props for obviously being cool with so many people making fun of him in books and movies. Look at the Goosebumps movie. If you saw that himself, you remember there was a scene where the main character and whoever else was with him and R.L. Stine's character, being played by Jack Black, in the car running away from one of the monsters that came to life from the books, or from the Goosebumps books or whatever. The main character just started to kind of bring out Stine's ire and get him to reveal his true identity as Stine. You know, when he was pretending to be just like a recluse next door, his neighbor. He was like, yeah, you know, those books really do kind of suck, and kind of went on from there. And it's like Jack Black, as R.L. Stine finally loses his cool, and he's like, hey, let me tell you something. Stephen King wishes he could be as good a writer as me. I mean, and you know what? I would actually almost agree with that. I started looking more into Stephen King's works in the last few years. I was never like a big fan or anything, but a lot of them do suck. I'm not gonna lie. So, whereas most people probably think he's way more brilliant than Stine, I have to say they're probably about on the same level. Stephen King's wrote a lot of good stories and fascinating stories, but then you gotta look at stuff like It or Maximum Overdrive, and yeah. And then, you know, at the end of that movie, obviously R.L. Stine himself knew all about this and was totally cool with being made fun of in the movie script, because he actually makes a cameo at the end of the movie. If you watched it, you'll probably remember that, where he calls Jack Black, you know, as the character of R.L. Stine. He's like, you know, addresses him as Mr. Stine. Jack Black addresses him as Mr. Black. That, you know, that was pretty funny. But here, you know, James Howell's clearly making fun of R.L. Stine's way of writing as well. Maybe even the character himself, because in Miles Tanner, because I do remember, you know, back when I was a huge Goosebumps fan, you know, reading all these other books that kind of touched up on Stine's personal life. And the reason he wrote the Goosebumps books and everything, and he was basically probably a lesser, you know, a little bit toned down version of Empty Graves in Edgar Allan Poe, but essentially the same thing. A lot of things actually scare Stine. I think he was, you know, kind of made himself out to be a bit of a recluse, has trouble socializing and all that. Just not a clear psychopath like Empty Graves obviously was, where he had, you know, some kind of hidden chainsaw maniac who was about to go postal on everybody, you know, any minute, hiding within. But yeah, I did like that James Howell parodies him with in the character of Empty Graves and his books in the form of flesh crawlers. That you know, that was a nice little addition to the story. And I guess without it, we wouldn't have really had a book, because that was one of the building blocks of the plot. You know, Empty Graves come into the house, and they were constantly, Pete and Howie are constantly talking about the Flesh Crawlers books and everything. Yeah, I mean, overall, it's still a good book. It's barely my least favorite of all 7 of them. So overall, I give this one a 7 out of 10, B-. It's above average. It's still good. So let's move on to number 6. Okay, so number 6 might actually be a little bit of a surprise, since it was an earlier Bunnicula book, but it actually is The Celery Stalks at Midnight. I was actually thinking for a while that it might actually be my least favorite of all the Bunnicula books. Still good, of course, don't get me wrong. I think my really only main gripe with it, but it's kind of a big one, is that I just thought, considering we already had at least one book where all the story takes place, pretty much entirely inside the Monroe household, which is the first Bunnicula book, The Celery Stalks at Midnight, considering we went back to Bunnicula and Chester, flipping out over Bunnicula again, we could have had a lot more happen. This is actually by far the shortest book, especially in terms of number of chapters. You might have noticed that. Only had 8. Really? I would have really liked it if the author had expanded upon the adventures of Harold, Chester, and Howie going outside the house. The whole thing was they're going around the neighborhood, the surrounding neighborhoods, possibly into like downtown Centerville, pretty far out from the house. They're trying to find the white vegetables that Bunnicula has drained already, their juices. Chester thinks they might become vampires, so he's trying to hunt them all down and spear them through the heart with toothpicks. You know, that was funny. But it would have been great if we had just a little bit more happen outside the Monroe household. In that, I just thought we could have had like a bigger, longer adventure. They pretty much do this whole thing within 4 or 5 hours. You know, it's obvious that the Monroes left on their little school project. What Toby and Pete were mainly doing, that school festival or whatever was happening, where Toby and Pete had a play going about vampires. It was obvious that the Monroes were gone by 8 or 9 in the morning. And by 1 o'clock, as said in Chapter 7, where Chester, Harold, and Howie interrupt this school festival and cause all the havoc that, you know, they do because of Chester's crazy suspicions, that took place before 1 o'clock. I remember there was a sign or something that Harold noticed and caused him to stop what he was doing in Chapter 7, where everything came to a head, saying, you know, it was talking about the play that Toby and Pete had come up with, Curse of the Vampires. It said something like a play by Toby and Peter Monroe at 1 o'clock today. So this had to have been like 4 or 5 hours at absolute most that they were even out of the house. I know this might sound like nitpicking or I'm really overanalyzing this, but I would have liked it if they had gone through, they'd had just a few more incidents, few more comical occurrences happen, other than just basically they meet Max just like a block down from the Monroe house, talk to him briefly. It was good to see. It was good to see a returning character, even for as brief a conversation as they had, just one appearance from a previous book, Halliday Inn. I was happy to see that with Max. That was good. But they just have a brief conversation with him, asking him about, you know, if he's seen white vegetables anywhere. Go to Max's house, spear a few vegetables there. Chester notices a garbage truck, gets on, you know, convinces Harold and Howie to get on the truck with him. They don't even make it all the way to the dump before being booted out of the back of the truck after spearing a few vegetables there by the driver. Then they notice the crowd. They walk back into town. They notice the crowd going towards the festival. They think everything is, you know, coming to a head there. They cause some chaos at that festival. That's it. Then they go home. And, I mean, really, even that was described in basically more detail than I think their adventures throughout Centerville had been in the book. Just them being back home and Harold just saying, yeah, you know, everything's cool. Bunnicula was, in fact, not turning everybody in town, not just the vegetables, but humans too. He wasn't turning them all into vampires. You know, everything's fine. I just thought more could have been done there. I would have really liked it if the book had been longer. But I guess what put this higher up on the list than Edgar Allan Poe was the fact that the illustrations were pretty good. Not the best, I don't think, in the whole series, but I do remember that it did have some impact. 2 particular illustrations had some impact on me as a child. First, the cover, where Harold and Chester, well, no, it's really Harold that just looks, you know, like he has a normal, pretty straight expression on his face on the cover of the book, as you can see here. Howie is barking up at this giant stalk of celery like, you know, yeah, I'm gonna get you. Chester's Chester's clearly hissing at it, thinking that this is some great force of evil. I actually really like that cover, and there was a sense of horror there as a kid, because I read, and I can't really credit this to the book, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. It was just, my childish mind. When I first came across this book in the public library when I lived in Spartanburg, South Carolina, from 7 to 12 years old, and at 7 or 8 years old was when my grandmother brought the first of the Bunnicula books to me that I read. And a little bit later, that was Nighty Nightmare. A little bit later after that, I went to the public library routinely with my parents and found Holiday Inn, Bunnicula, and the Celery Stalks at Midnight there. So when I saw the Celery Stalks at Midnight in the library, I distinctly remember that I read the title too fast. I didn't even realize it was a Bunnicula book right then and there. At least, not right away. And I thought it was saying the cellar stacks at midnight. That actually conveyed I was actually a little intimidated by that to read this book, because I thought because of what I thought the title was at first. The cellar stacks at midnight, not the celery stalks at midnight. Looking back on it, I would have imagined myself as an adult. The cellar stacks at midnight makes me think of like that that movie that I can't remember the name of the director, but it was part of a trilogy of extremely violent horror movies where basically the whole theme is just death. Did you ever see The House by the Cemetery? That's crazy. I would have been, had I known what that movie was as a child, I would have been thinking of the cellar stacks at midnight. I would have been thinking of the cellar, the basement from The House by the Cemetery, where pretty much anybody who went down those stairs never came back alive. Like some kind of horrific evil is accumulating, growing in power down there. You walk down the stairs, you're going to suffer a horrific death. Never come back. So that's what I'm thinking of there. But that was a really good illustration for the cover. It looks kind of like Harold, Howie, and Chester. They're going around town. Maybe they came into an alley at some point. They see this gigantic, monstrous stalk of celery, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Bunnicula. This is Bunnicula's handiwork. This thing is probably sentient and is about to reach out with its leaflets and strangle each of us to death," or something like that. But the other illustration that had a lot of impact on me was at the beginning of chapter 7, where Harold, Howie, and Chester make it to the school festival, and they don't understand what's going on at first. They think that Bunnicula has turned all the masses into zombies or vampires or whatever. The illustration at the beginning of that chapter is Chester. I find out eventually, of course, as I'm reading it. This is Chester making a jump at Mrs. Monroe's carrot cake that she had baked for a portion of the festival that involved, like some kind of baking contest, whatever that was. Yeah, that was just Chester landing into the carrot cake. It was nothing. It turns out to be nothing at all. But as a kid, again, seeing that illustration at first before I read through and grasp what's going on, I'm imagining that as Chester actually making some kind of heroic, possibly suicidal dive into like this mystical mirror that maybe Bunnicula has used, or the head vampire, whoever he has turned to kind of lead the other forces of humans that he has turned into vampires. Some kind of mirror that holds all their powers, that maybe if Chester can just shatter it with one heroic jump into the mirror, and it will lift the curse. Everybody will turn back to normal or something. That was actually a little bit horrifying to me. That's how I pictured that was Chester landing into some kind of mystical mirror of some sort. I really like that. And of course, just the quality illustrations. I like the way Harold, Chester, and Howie generally looked in those illustrations, so that was good too. Probably another thing, aside from the fact that it was good that James Howe actually, this is the first book where Howie is a starring character, he didn't just forget, he didn't just add in as an aside at the end of Holiday Inn, the previous book, that the Monroes had adopted one of Howard and Heather's dachshund puppies and named it Howie. He didn't just forget about that. He's actually, I have to hand it to him. He's a lot better at continuity than a lot of video games and movies that in my cynical adulthood I see nowadays, where I just start to think that continuity is more of a privilege, not a right. But James Howe remembered it, and he started including Howie as a starring character after that in all the books to come after Holiday Inn. He didn't just forget about the fact that the Monroes adopted this puppy named Howie at the end of Holiday Inn. That was good. But what I really liked and just now noticed, a big positive, was the clever use of reference to the Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. You probably noticed that as soon as you saw the Let's Read of The Celery Stalks at Midnight in the last chapter, where Harold, Chester, and Howie and Bunnicula, of course, are safe at home. Everything's cool. You probably noticed that immediately. I actually did not notice this entire time until I did the Let's Reads, and I must have read each of these books 20, if not 30, even 40 times in my 30 years of life. Where towards the very end, Harold, Howie, and Chester are settling down to sleep, and Chester's like, "Hey, what's that sound?" And he looks under the couch. He brings out some kind of white vegetable, I guess, just another vegetable that Bunnicula has drained and probably hid under the couch just so the Monroes would never find out. And Harold's like, "How did that artichoke heart get there?" But Chester is imagining, he says something like, "Here, it is the beating of this hideous heart." I cannot believe I never noticed that was a clear reference, an obvious one, but still clever, to Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. If you don't know that story by Edgar Allan Poe, it's about like a caretaker. I've seen it both ways, male or female, caretaker of an old man, and just the old man's piercing stare through the darkness whenever the caretaker opens the door to his room. It eventually drove him mad, so he murdered the old man that he or she was taking care of. And of course, their guilty conscience weighs on them, and when the police come to investigate, they start hearing what they're imagining, the old man's heart beating under the floorboards where they hid the body. And it's a pretty good story. I've seen it I never actually read it. I've only seen it like 2 different times in a school play throughout my time as a child, in school. But it's good. It's clever, and I also, of course, just now noticed that the title of the entire chapter was referencing that home is where the heart is. All this time up until I did this Let's Read, this last time that I read through The Celery Stalks at Midnight, I thought it was just some stupid cliche, just to kind of let us know that the conflict of the story is resolved and everybody is all peaceful and happy now. Home is where the heart is. Just some kind of cliche saying about that. But no, it's also home is where the heart is, the artichoke, the vegetable that Harold and Chester find under the couch. That was great. So, but, again, I just, going back to my main, if you can call it a gripe, just what I thought could have been a tremendous improvement upon the story. It would have been really nice if Harold and Chester and Howie had gotten to just 1 or 2 more events around town other than, what the book lays out for us. Just could have been more to that. I really don't know how else to say it. So, all in all, I give this book a B- also, but a little bit better than Edgar Allan Poe, so 7.25 on that. Okay, so next up, number 5. It's probably going to be the most if any of you are actually trying to think ahead, guess, how these picks will go, this is probably going to be the most shocking to you. Yeah, it's actually the original Bunnicula book. Bunnicula Strikes Back, kind of like almost it could have been a direct sequel to Bunnicula, practically, except for the part where you gotta wonder where Howie came in at some point. But that's about the only piece of continuity I think that would be thoroughly screwed up if the only other book, the only sequel to Bunnicula that James Howe wrote was Bunnicula Strikes Again. It's like Bunnicula. It's everything Bunnicula is, only just a little bit better in a lot of aspects, so that's why it's actually higher up on the list than the original. But don't get me wrong, this is still a great book. It's what started it all. I said it before, but it really is a shame that James Howe's wife, Deborah, who is said to have co-written Bunnicula with him, the first book, died before she could see how it all turned out. When he had it published, how much of an impact it made. I mean, all the spin-offs, all the sequels, all the fan base that turned out because of Bunnicula, just everything that came afterwards, just because of this one book that, even as a child, and I'll admit, I did read pretty well for my age. I mean, I could get through it in like an hour and a half or less. As an adult, probably an hour tops. If I were reading it to myself, I know it took longer than that to read aloud. But yeah, I think the thing that I like most about this book is the pacing. Although I do have one tiny gripe about that at the same time. I'll just get to what's positive about it first. I think James Howe did a really good job leading up with the pacing, leading up to when Chester finally concludes that Bunnicula is in fact a vampire. Granted, Chester flips out, kind of makes it out to be worse than it really is. The only thing the only physical harm he's seen Bunnicula do to anything is just to vegetables. Well, so what? They don't have feelings. They're organic. They're basically made of carbon like human beings and animals and stuff, but I don't think they have feelings, So who cares if Bunnicula victimizes them? But the evidence Chester mounted up, I mean, he didn't just jump to conclusions on this. He didn't just, think right away out of just a hidden subconscious case of sibling rivalry, jealousy that, Bunnicula is new to the household, probably going to get all the attention. Chester never even seemed like he cared about any of that kind of stuff. I mean, Harold suspected that he did all along because cats like to act real prissy and play mind games with you, but at least to Chester himself, his actions really never seemed to get that across. So I think he actually did. It was nice that he took a good 2-3 chapters to observe Bunnicula's behavior, and his suspicions slowly grew over time to finally conclude. And the evidence was there that Bunnicula was a vampire. Again, obviously not a harmful one. He never attacked human beings, so Chester made it out to be something more than it really was. But I definitely can't blame him for concluding that Bunnicula is a vampire of sorts. I mean, red eyes, glowing in the dark, the fangs that are visible to, at least to Chester. I mean, the Monroes are obviously stupid and oblivious people. They never notice something like that. Bunnicula gets out of his cage all the time by himself when nobody's looking. How does he do that? It's practically magic. Sleeps during the day, and I'm just assuming that he wasn't anywhere near a window in the living room or curtains were always drawn over the window he was in front of, such that daylight could actually harm him, Because otherwise, that would be kind of a big detail that Chester is supposedly such a well-read, intelligent creature. It doesn't seem likely he would have missed something like that. Oh, but Bunnicula's not harmed by the sun, so he can't be a vampire. No, Bunnicula simply sleeps during the day, and I can only assume that, it's suggested that he's just in a generally dark part of the room. He's not, directly in front of a window where rays of sun would actually do harm to him. Most of all, he manages to get the refrigerator door open by himself. Now, what bunny rabbit who weighs like 5 pounds tops do you know who could do that? Admittedly, I had a domesticated potbelly pig. as a pet as a child. He was actually able to get the fridge door open sometimes. He didn't drain he didn't drain vegetables or their juices, but he weighed like 50 pounds and basically had a body made of steel. I mean, it was amazing. This was the most... We would beat the crap out of this pig. I mean, I don't mean that seriously. Like, don't call PETA on me. But he was so troublesome. I mean, and it was just like, no matter how hard you spanked him or thumped him on the snout or yelled at him, he was oblivious to it. I think that eventually, my father said one time, he actually took a coat hanger to Hamilton. That was his name, the name of the pig I had as a pet as a kid. He actually took like a wire coat hanger to his backside once. Hamilton would just look at him like, "You finished?" I mean, nothing fazed him. So you can imagine his snout was actually strong enough. I mean, if he nudged you with his snout, it actually hurt considerably, especially if he sideswiped you in anger, which you might have heard about miniature pigs being ornery like that. They'll actually do something called a sideswipe, where they kind of clip you with their teeth and like backhand you with their snout at the same time. It actually hurts. So I could understand how he could get the fridge door open, but I digress. How would Bunnicula be able to? Unless he had mystical powers of some sort. So I can only assume that the Bunnicula books, all along were trying to get the point across that Bunnicula really is a vampire, and maybe that story Chester told about Bunnicula's origins in Nighty Nightmare, coming from Transylvania, his parents, who they were, the mad doctor who bred them, and obviously, eventually discovered there are more people of his race like himself, called vampires. Well, it seems like the book is actually trying to get the point across that, yeah, it's probably true. This isn't just entirely Chester's imagination. He just blows it out of proportion because he wants to play the hero. He wants to imagine that that Bunnicula is doing evil on a practical level here, rather than just being of evil origins, but not causing any real harm to anybody. So the pacing on that, leading up to that, was really good. Probably a small gripe I have with it, though, and this is probably personal, because if I tried to think about this realistically, yeah, it would be an easy conclusion to come to. That solution, would come about this easily. It's just the fact that it happened practically off screen. In the span of like a page and a half, in such a short time, in such a short amount of words, we went from total disaster where Harold could not save Bunnicula from Chester's methods of starving him in Chapter 8. That whole plan went to ruin because Chester intercepted them in time, fought with Bunnicula, and the Monroes catch him. Now Chester's in big trouble again. Harold thinks he's in trouble because he's about to go to the vet for vaccinations, and Bunnicula is still starving. Who knows how long he has before the lack of food actually, he actually succumbs to that. Yeah, realistically, it's like the Monroes notice something is wrong finally, and they're like, well, let's take him to the vet. They don't know exactly what's going on, but they, actually act intelligent here and take the animals to the vet. Chester obviously has psychological problems. Bunnicula has physical, problem of some sort, some kind of sickness, and they're like, well, while we're at it, let's take Harold with us because he might be due for vaccinations, which of course sends Harold into a panic himself too. So the conflict there with Harold personally is also he doesn't get any sleep that night, worrying about the shots the next day, the needles that are probably going to be going into his eyeballs. And it's just another way of seeing how different Harold's personality is from Chester. He gets scared very easily. He's not as brave as Chester. He's certainly not as impetuous in it, or quick thinking. So, yeah, it's like practically off screen. Monroes take all the animals to the vet. They come back. Chester's got a frigging cat psychologist. a therapist for cats. I can't believe... As an aside, I can't believe that I never actually looked that up to see if that was a thing. It sounds silly, but I wonder if there is actually a small chance that if I were to Google search that, it would actually in fact be a thing, and I need to look that up. So, yeah, Chester's got a guy head shrinking him. I mean, I'm sure it's not the same as like sits the animal down on a couch. They talk about all their problems, like with a human being, but in some way or another, he's going to find out what's psychologically wrong with Chester. Bunnicula gets put on a liquid diet so he can eat more easily, and supposedly it won't harm his digestive system, which must be very fragile right now from all this time spent starving. And Harold isn't due for his vaccinations at all, so everything's good. It's like immediate solution. And yeah, it's not a big gripe because it's realistically, that's how it would go down. But I don't know, I just wish there had been something more to that. It just happened so quickly, I guess. But hey, other than that, the pacing is terrific in this book. Illustrations are probably, I mean, if I had to rank books on illustrations alone, it'd be about midway up. I really didn't like the ones from Edgar Allan Poe. And probably my favorite ones are from Holiday Inn and Nighty Nightmare, because I think they seem to really convey... That and Cellar Stalks at Midnight, actually, those three together really seem to convey a sense of horror somehow. I mean, at least in my sense as a child, reading these for the first time, they managed to kind of give off a creepy vibe, I guess, for lack of a better term, just in a real generic way. I can't really explain it. My favorite one, of course, is, and also my favorite moment, as you can see here in the picture, is where, chapter 6, where kind of everything comes to a head. That's like the climax of the book, where things really start to go down. Chester actually has a plan to destroy Bunnicula. Of course, it's a kid's book. He's not really going to do that. He's not going to actually, it ends up being comedic. He gets it all wrong. He's been reading this book about the entire vampire mythos, how to identify them, history of vampire sightings, whatever that was about. What was it called? The Mark of the Vampire. And, he's kind of flying by the seat of his pants at the same time, even as he's read through this book, because he has Harold going along like, so he needs a steak now? Okay, so let me go to the kitchen right quick. I know just what to get. He gets the wrong one. That actually sounds like something stupid Harold would do. I mean, that Chester actually thought that steak, as in the food, the actual food item, was somehow going to kill Bunnicula, so he's tried to pound that steak through Bunnicula's heart. And he's being real theatrical about it there, too. You see in the picture, I just really love that, I mean, I think Chester's actually like giving this war cry, or maybe some kind of lament at the same time that things had to be taken this far, because the Moreaus just wouldn't heed this warning. He's like, I don't want to kill you, Bunnicula. I really don't want to, but you leave me no choice. And Harold's kind of got this look on his face as he's reading from the book, like, is this really happening right now? It's almost like he's self-aware that this is a ridiculous, moment in his life, and he can't believe that he's being a part of it. So, and that's my favorite illustration and moment in the book there as well. And of course, at the end of chapter 6, just after the Moreaus come home and see what Chester's trying to do, and they're like, he's gone psycho. Throw him outside at least. They get a little bit smarter and actually take him to an animal head shrinker finally to quell Chester's murderous tendencies. But at the very least, they put him outside of the house for the night. And I just kind of like, I thought it was real tongue-in-cheek how Harold kind of starts monologuing there in the last full page or so total, and it kind of goes over each of the animals who were the key characters in this chapter in turn. He observes Bunnicula. He's reading through the book. He looks up at Bunnicula and is like, so Chester actually wanted to drive an actual stake through his heart. Like, it's amazing. It's amazing Chester didn't think to get his claws and fashion a wooden splinter from an old chair leg or the leg of a couch or something, and actually claw at it long enough to kind of make a shiv out of it and shank Bunnicula through the heart with that, which probably would have been really easy to do. I mean, maybe with even as something as tiny or endurable as a toothpick. like they used in the celery stalks at midnight to spear the vegetables through the heart, the so-called heart that they thought, Bunnicula might have affected. He might have actually been able to do some real harm to Bunnicula, like being like a 3-pound, very soft-bellied little bunny rabbit. So Harold's like, well, have no regrets about missing a scene like that. Poor Bunnicula. He looks up at Chester, and suddenly, he actually gets sympathy for Chester at the same time. He looks at him through the window. And it's like, I guess he's imagining that Chester, as you see in the illustration at the end of chapter 6, where Chester is clearly looking unhappy through the window. It looks like I'm imagining that he's actually trying desperately to grab the Monroe's attention, like calling out desperately to him, like, no, you got the wrong guy. Bunnicula's the evil one here. I'm trying to save you from him. Don't keep him in there with you. He'll destroy us all. Like, trying desperately to plead for understanding, and he can't be heard. And Monroe's probably aren't paying attention to his face through the window, so Harold kind of observes this and he's like, oh, poor Chester. It's like, and then just at the end, he turns sympathies upon himself. He's like, the Monroes decided to give me that steak before, and that was yummy and everything, but it's all gone now. Poor Harold. I just love little gems like that where James Howe gets really tongue-in-cheek with his writing. So, yeah, that's pretty much, I guess, all I have to say about the first Bunnicula book. It's a simple story. Vampire rabbit, sounds silly, but it just, look at how well it was written, and the monster in a good way that it created. Just that one book. So kudos to James and Deborah Howe for that, definitely. All in all, I give this book a solid 8 out of 10, which would be a B+ in my book. Okay, so number 4, exactly halfway up the list. Actually, Bunnicula strikes again. It's one of the later books. It was written past the turn of the millennium. If I don't know, I might be off by a few years, because suddenly a vague memory came upon me that it was actually written in the late 90s, while the previous 5 books were all really old school. But like I said in number 5, I actually like this a little bit better than the very first Bunnicula book, because it's like that book except kind of on steroids. It just does just about everything a little bit better. Illustrations, really don't have anything in particular to say about that. I guess same quality offhand as the first Bunnicula. And it's pretty much the same situation, just Harold and Chester, and of course we have Howie now, are out of the house more. I did like the fact that James Howe, actually took him out of the house. They spent a little time outside searching for Bunnicula and all. Probably my biggest reason for putting this above the first Bunnicula is that the banter here between Harold and Chester, and to a lesser extent Howie, is the greatest in all the books. Just the way Chester insults Harold's intelligence and or personality in general all the time, calls him out on laziness, and Harold's just like, I like the fact that Harold actually doesn't have something quick to retort with every single time Chester insults him, either aggressively or passive aggressively. I like the fact that it's like Harold kind of bottles it up for a while, and after so much, he'll just kind of come back with one, sometimes quick, just like one-liner that puts Chester in his place and kind of evens the playing field. Kind of like if you ever listen to the epic rap battles of history videos on YouTube, it seems that the person who goes last, who goes second of the two that are battling against each other, they always manage to do like a mic drop, almost always. Very last thing they say, and that's the end of the battle, because the first person already had his turn. So it's kind of like that between Harold and Chester, and I think the best example of the banter back and forth between them that shows how good friends they are, despite their despite their opposing personalities in so many ways. It's just, I don't know, I just can't help but smile at that. When in chapter 1, when Harold, he actually kind of freaks out a little, and usually you attribute that to Chester, but no, it's Harold who kind of gets this thing going. The plot of Bunnicula strikes again, where he hears the ending of the Sherlock Holmes mystery book that Toby's reading, and you know, it was like a surprise ending that even though Sherlock Holmes was the good guy, he and his nemesis Moriarty both go, you know, over the precipice and into the midst of the waterfall below, just practically bottomless fall, surely dead. Harold's like, you know, what? That can't be. It just shook up everything I've come to be comfortable with, that I believe in. Is life normal? Is it proceeding on as normal? What should be happening right now? And he rushes down the stairs to check on Harold and Howie. That's his way. It briefly, at a glance, shows how close the relationship between Harold, Chester, and Howie are. I really like that. Very, very minor point, but I did like that. The fact that Harold goes down to them, first and foremost, to check and make sure that things haven't been shaken up, that at least Harold's life, as he knows it, is proceeding normally. And of course, sure enough, it's proven to him, at least at that time, you know, when Chester comes out of the kitchen, he's like, "What's your problem, Harold?" Because Harold's like yelling for him and Howie in the living room in the dark, and Chester comes out of the kitchen, he's like, "What's your problem?" And, you know, so Harold's like, "Where were you? I mean, you're normally supposed to be in the chair, like, reading a horror novel or you know, some great piece of literature or something." Chester's like, "I was just getting a midnight snack. I mean, considering how much you think about food all the time because you're a dumb, lazy mutt, I figured you'd be joining me." And so, and then not only that, but Howie comes running down the stairs shortly afterwards. Oh, excuse me. I had music going on in the background and some actual like an MP3 file that was actually more talking. It was Dane Cook, a skit from him, rather than an actual song. Thought I'd change that up because it's kind of getting me off track trying to talk here. So, yeah, and then Howie comes running down the stairs, and he's just being his usual self. He's like, "Oh my gosh, Uncle Harold, Pop, you wouldn't believe, you know, the book I just read, it was so scary." And that's when Flesh Crawlers and Empty Graves, as the author, first comes up. Pretty brief, but I like that, you know, James Howell touched upon that as kind of a prerequisite for Edgar Allan Poe, the only book to come after that. And you know, and so Howie's naming off all the funny sounding titles, clearly meant as a joke, of all the Flesh Crawlers books, and Chester criticizes the writing, so there's already a subtle jab at R.L. Stine before Edgar Allan Poe gets started. That was just great. And Harold's like, "I could have cried at how normal everything was. This is exactly what I was expecting from my interactions with Harold and Chester, my two best friends in the world." And what's even better is, yeah, it's normal at the moment, but the fact that the plot kind of gets started after that Chester notices once again, in his eyes, that something really is wrong. Bunnicula is out of his cage again, or I don't think that was it. It was like he noticed that Bunnicula's kind of general expression had changed. He didn't seem to have as much energy as normal, but he did for a time. And so Chester, you know, comes up with the crazy conclusion about, "Hey, Mother's Day was recently past. It was just Bunnicula. He thought he was going to meet his mother again." And of course that means that they were going to hatch some diabolical scheme for world domination via infecting every human on the planet and turning them to vampires. I don't know. Chester kind of, you know, lets things get to his head, as we well know by this point. That whole plot, the Chester's reasoning behind what Bunnicula was up to, why he was doing it, why he might be hatching some evil plan, I admit it was a little bit dumb. So that was actually something that was done slightly worse than the original Bunnicula, because Chester Chester simply thought Bunnicula was a vampire in the first book and had ample evidence to back it up. He went to crazy extremes to eliminate this evil threat that he perceived, but it wasn't too big a deal with me, the fact that it was a little bit stupider at this point. Besides, Bunnicula kind of did acting in line with what Chester was speculating. So the fact that, you know, everything was normal for Harold in the first chapter, he was just trying to make sure that, you know, life was normal. And immediately after that, of course, in the second chapter, we start to see that something is up, or rather, Chester flips out again, and we go from there. It in a way, it's like saying, you know, just when you think everything is, just when you breathe a sigh of relief that everything is right with the world, things come tumbling down. And Chester, I guess, you know, it can be argued that this is the most trouble that Chester has gotten Harold and Howie in yet. I'm sure they certainly didn't appreciate the failed first attempt when they went out of the house to find Bunnicula downtown, and that just ended up with Chester leaving Harold and Howie for dead, so to speak, with the attack from the skunk in the alleyway that Chester mistook for Bunnicula. What I really liked about this book also was that it brought back characters from immediately the previous book. I would kind of like to see Max again in a second. It's better than nothing, and I would still say that the characters from Return to Holiday Inn that came back at one point or another in Bunnicula Strikes Again, they were at least still had more meaning to them than Max's very brief reappearance in The Celery Stalks at Midnight. And they brought back just more than one. It was actually 4 characters in all that came back in Bunnicula Strikes Again, who were Harold, Chester, and Howie's roommates in Return to Holiday Inn. We had Linda, Bob, and then later Felony and Misdemeanor, because there was kind of a connection between those 4. And I like the contrast there. I don't know, James Howe may not have even been thinking of it, but I love the subtle contrast between Linda's and Bob's personalities and Felony's and Misdemeanors, despite the fact that obviously they know each other well enough from outside of Chateau Bow Wow in the previous book. So, you know, that was another really great part that I thought was in Bunnicula Strikes Again, was about midway through the book, when Harold, Chester, and Howie first make their way through Centerville on the search for Bunnicula, and they meet up with Linda and Bob, and sure enough, you know, just reiterating how much of like these snooty rich assholes that Linda and Bob are. You know, they are literally chained to like a trough made of silver, and they're slurping Perrier out of it or something like that. And I think Bob or Linda, I can't remember which one, mentioned at some point, I wonder what's keeping Tom and Tracy, who they call the kids, their 2 owners. It was like the Tom and Tracy were going to be bringing espresso out to them once they got out of the coffee shop. On their way out, they were actually bringing a latte to Linda and Bob as well. I don't know. I thought that was really cute, and I like the banter there between Chester especially and Linda and Bob, who look at him as though he's crazy, and they have good reason to, despite being all snooty and upper class. And then finally, I guess what really propels this above the first Bunnicula book, other than the particular banter that Harold, Chester, and Howie had at the beginning of Chapter 1 that I said was my favorite conversation between them in terms of humor and snarkiness and everything, was the ending. How I like the fact that James Howe actually ended the main story here at the end of this book. He had one more to come, Edgar Allan Poe, after that. But it was just kind of like an after story where, you know, there's a shift in tone, and, you know, the conflict is not the same. The main conflict is ended here, that even though Harold probably had the biggest letdown towards the end of this book, in kind of the climax, when he and Howie are forced to abandon Chester at Dr. Greenbrier's office, because they realize that Chester, Harold's just like, I can't go along with your intent anymore, Chester. It's obvious Bunnicula is harmless ultimately, and you have no right to kill him. You have no right to even try to stop him. He's not doing anything wrong. And Chester's just like, I can't be friends with you two anymore. You're traitors to me. You're dead to me. We kind of get serious there for a second, and I admit that it seems really... It might actually seem kind of silly, because within the next chapter, this happened at the end of chapter 8, where Harold and Howie were forced to abandon Chester, and it seems like, friendship is forever severed there. Of course, I'm sure even as a kid you were reading all along, you're like, oh, okay, it's really not gonna, that's not permanent, it's really not gonna stay that way, everything will be resolved at the end, we'll be all nice and happy. Yeah, that's true. And it's also true that maybe it also seems silly to even have in the book the seriousness is undermined with that conflict being resolved pretty much in an instant by the end of the very next chapter, chapter 9, where Chester shows up to the theater and manages to intercept Harold and Howie before they can rescue Bunnicula, and he's like, I'm going to do something about this myself. But, in my personal opinion, I actually really like the fact that it was resolved. The whole, the conflict where, friendship ties might have been forever severed there. I like the fact that that was resolved, just restored in an instant, because I can actually see that happening, where Chester just suddenly noticing that all four of their lives, everybody present in the theater, in the abandoned theater there, when he hears the demolition crew and the wrecking ball coming, Chester just immediately kind of does an about face, and it's just like in an instant he tells Harold and Howie to run while he dives for Bunnicula to protect him. It's just like sorry, my voice cracked there for a second. I like the fact that I do like the fact that it actually happened in an instant there, because it's believable that really the lives of everybody present there takes precedent over Chester's personal prejudices or suspicions about Bunnicula, and he's willing to just, in an instant, he does an about face and tries to save Bunnicula. Because, well, let's be honest, if, Wrecking Ball coming through could easily kill all of them. They're about to be crushed underneath a bunch of debris and stuff. By some miracle, Chester manages to kind of, well, he doesn't actually protect Bunnicula himself. He tried to, and it's true that instead Bunnicula just happened to be trapped underneath a safe spot, underneath the debris in a safe spot of some sort, where it was like a beam fell across at just the right spot and kind of shielded Bunnicula from the rest of the debris, so we had a little bit of breathing room or something. But Chester saved the day by leading the Monroes and whoever else was with them from the demolition crew into finding Bunnicula beneath all that rubble and rescuing him. I love the fact that that's the way it ended, and now Chester is actually, of course, in Chester's own eyes, he'll try to play it cool, but in Harold's point of view, it's clear that Chester is now protected of, not only friends with Bunnicula, but very protective of him. Of course, Chester tries to play it off. He's like, I'm more protecting Bunnicula from himself. I realize now that it's just the evil force. It's more of an evil force within him than Bunnicula himself who is at fault. So I am protecting Bunnicula from himself. No, it's obvious. Chester and Bunnicula are now friends, And I like the fact that Chester tries to play it off just to kind of retain his image. Overall, just a great book. Somehow even better than the original Bunnicula. So especially for being a more modern book, and the fact that I read this as an adult, and therefore reading that, if I'm reading it for the first time as an adult like I did with Edgar Allan Poe, then my perceptions are probably a little bit skewed towards the more cynical. So it's amazing how much I still love this book and actually place it even higher on the ratings than the original Bunnicula book. So definitely kudos to James Howell there. It's like the main story is over, but you know, we still have more to come if he wants, and subsequently he did a good job with Bunnicula meets Edgar Allan Poe. It's amazing how he makes all of that work out, what could easily become failures in his books, as especially as a longtime fan like myself might perceive them, reading the two more modern two books of Bunnicula meets Edgar Allan Poe and Bunnicula Strikes Again. So overall, I give this book an 8.5, which is definitely an A-. Okay, so next up, from this point on, if I rated the last book as an A-, you know that really the last three books in this series that I still have to rate are nothing short of fantastic, even if they might have a few flaws, but they're probably extremely minor. So this one is Holiday Inn in the number 3 spot, the first one. I don't know how James Howell manages to make all this work out when he writes, but you think that if there's going to be a sequel to Bunnicula, it should star Bunnicula at least just as much as it did, and to as much of a degree in the first one as it does. It's amazing. This book doesn't even have Bunnicula. He's mentioned very briefly in the beginning of chapter 1, and now the rest of the book is totally more about the misadventures of Harold and Chester, a monster of the week kind of thing, where we kind of go away from the main conflict for a while. It's great though. It's a game of Clue in an animal boarding kennel. I love this book. All the characters were very interesting. I mean, most of them even had great names. There's Lyle, the crazy cat, who, I mean, his only character trait is that he belongs in a straitjacket, but he comes off as interesting and entertaining. And then there's Taxi. What kind of name is that? But it's awesome. Who's like this little mutt. Nobody can figure out what breed of dog he is, and he's very odd looking. And he has this weird idealistic friendship with Max. And Max and Georgette, the bulldog, the bulldog from the rough side of the neighborhood, and the dainty little poodle with the southern accent. Louise, the French poodle who was jealous of Max and Georgette's seeming growing romance. I mean, all of these characters, they're so... You might feel like there's really nothing complicated about them, that they aren't even really written with character arcs where they change over time, over the course of the book. So simple to come up with, and yet delivered so well. I mean, that's really all I know to say. That's a big reason why this book, Holiday Inn, is above the previous 4 that I've talked about. And of course, really just the whole plot in and of itself, the fact that it's a murder mystery, really makes this book more entertaining than the previous 4, just kind of naturally. I mean, almost by default. I really like the fact that they also introduced Howie at the end of this. You don't think that he's going to be a big character at first. It's just like, oh, the Monroes decided to adopt one of Howard's and Heather's kids, who were 2 prime suspects in Chester's murder investigation when Louise disappeared. And he thought, instead that Louise had been murdered. And again, this is one time where, Chester comes off as really, like, hot-headed, maybe even crazy, but at the same time, I really kind of have to sympathize with him. I can see where he comes up with this. It's like the evidence is very circumstantial, but it seems it's so convenient to actually have played all out to where nobody really got hurt in the end. Again, this is a kid's book, so of course it will turn out that neither Chester nor Louise nor anybody else who had seemingly disappeared from sight in Chateau Bow Wow were actually murdered. But I do like the fact that going back to my original point, the fact that Howie ended up becoming a mainstay character, that he ends up looking to Harold and Chester as his friends and parental figures. And, you know, that's just, you don't get any idea of that at the end of the book, chapter 12. But I guess now that I think about it, I guess the fact that he was brought up so briefly at the end, that's the ending, just kind of out of nowhere. Oh, we're adopting one of Howard's and Heather's kids. We're naming him Howie, and he's going to come home to live with us. I mean, I guess that if you read it as an adult, you would think, oh, well, in the Bunnicula sequels, the sequels to come after this one, well, I mean, obviously Howie is going to be a mainstay character. But as a child, had no idea. And I really like the fact that James Howe decided to expand upon that, and in fact, make Howie, you know, he didn't just forget about it in the very next book, the fact that they adopted Howie, and Howie actually becomes one of the main protagonists in all the books to come. Now, Howie sucks as a writer himself pretty much, at least in comparison to his Uncle Harold, as we found out in reading just one of Howie's written books, Howie Monroe and the Doghouse of Doom, from the great Tales from the House of Bunnicula series. Ugh. Again, love you, James Howe, but oh my gosh, what was that? I mean, I'm glad you tried to do something different. You tried to do something fresh, but yeah. So we have the murder mystery there with Chester immediately has his suspicions right away about being boarded at a kennel. He's really melodramatic about it. He's like, our family, the Monroes, the humans we trusted all these years, they're just abandoning us. They're gonna lock us up and throw away the key. And then sure enough, you got, the very first night there, they witness a pretty heated argument between Max, Georgette, and Louise, although it's basically Louise who's doing most of the drama queening there. Howling in the middle of the night, which, hey, if you hear that, if it wakes you up out of your sleep, that's going to terrify you. And, of course, later to be discovered from Howard and Heather, who were simply, I don't know, I guess Chester was right in his diagnosis that they are of a breed known as wire-haired dachshunds. I think that was just his way of maybe kind of downplaying without making Harold just brush it off like, okay, whatever, Chester, you're being retarded. Chester's like kind of nice way of calling them werewolves, but I guess they are dachshunds, right? Because Howie is repeatedly said to be a dachshund, and he's one of their children. So yeah, it's obviously at the end, it's obvious they were howling, just out of kind of like a nervousness. They knew that Heather's Heather was due to be giving birth soon. It must be terrifying in the middle of the night, especially on a dark and stormy night, as it, that was repeatedly the weather conditions at Chateau Bow. It was just dark and stormy. I mean, yeah, again, another reason why I can see why Chester would arrive at the conclusions that he did, that, some great evil is at work in this place. And of course, Louise disappears. Chester believes that she has been murdered because Max and Taxi both showed some fascination with methods of murder, and specifically how to get rid of women who are in your life and being inconvenient presences in your life. And then, Georgette, of course, you think that as much as she flirts with Max, of course she really does it with just about everybody, more or less. Of course, there's reason to believe that she would have a motive for murder because Louise is in her way. She wants Max all to herself, all that kind of stuff. Lyle's just psychotic, and Howard and Heather, well, if they're werewolves, they're just evil, so they're going to do stuff like murder people, Again, there's really great setup to a murder mystery, and I guess if there was a gripe I had about this, it wasn't the conclusion. The fact that it turns out it was just Harrison and, one of the human characters who was actually he just had, as a young, impetuous person, I think it was said that he was in his 20s. He never went to college. The fact that it turns out it was just a botched kidnapping attempt on his part. That's all it amounted to. I don't know. I guess the conclusion in of itself, who it really was, what was really going on, may seem pretty lame. That there were no actual real murders, and not even Dr. Greenbrier is at fault for anything. He has all the look of like a mad scientist, but he didn't do anything wrong at all. He's just really incompetent. I mean, if that's a crime. And I guess as a veterinarian, he should be prosecuted one of these days. As many times as he loses the animals who are boarding at his kennel. But, yeah, it's just Harrison. Ultimately, it amounts to just a botched kidnapping attempt in which he wanted to make a lot of money right away without having to work. Whatever. But, that may seem lame. But all the evidence that Chester gathered, and I'm sorry if I knocked on the mic there. I was trying to scratch my face, and so you might have heard me accidentally brush up against the mic. I really like the way it all played out. How Chester was able to explain afterwards, after Harrison was found out and justice was done, and it turns out all the guests of Chateau Bow Wow, none of them are cool. They're all innocent. They're all safe now. I really like the way Chester had explained it all. I thought it was a pretty good backstory to all the goings on in Chateau Bow Wow. Not gonna bother getting into all the detail with that. That could take a really long time. And this is just supposed to be a brief, informal summary, pretty much. But yeah, really interesting characters, fun characters. The fact that the plot was basically a murder mystery. The illustrations, especially, these are some of my favorite illustrations out of all the Bunnicula books. They really give off a creepy vibe in a lot of them, especially when I was reading them as a kid. I mean, and now that I look back on it, I really don't know. I really can't tell you why, but the one in chapter 9 where, and I'll bring it up here for you in a second. The one in chapter 9 where it's just Harold, Taxi, and Lyle left, and I'm really just imagining, as a kid reading this, that this place is just brimming with evil. And of course, they even try to give that impression more so in the sequel, Return to Holiday Inn. Everybody has disappeared. Harold doesn't have anything figured out. As far as he knows, Louise, Chester, his best friend in the world, and now possibly Max, Georgette, Howard, and Heather are all dead. And it's just Lyle, and Taxi. He doesn't even know if he can trust him anymore. But at the same time, he's kind of formed like a temporary, maybe uneasy or begrudging alliance with them, trying to figure out what's going on and to make it so that even if everybody else has already met an evil end, he's hoping that it won't happen to he or Taxi or Lyle either, because they're all each other's got now. And there's been no sign of Harrison, Jill, or Dr. Greenbrier in a long while. So it's like nothing is safe. There's really a sense of dreadful anticipation. And again, overthinking this, of course, as a child, because it's not really going to turn out this way in a mere kid's book. But that is the sense I got, and I really like that. And in this picture where Harold and Taxi, it's like Taxi kind of took Harold by surprise, like, "Hey Harold, what's going on?" And there's the storm in the background, and you see Lyle far off in the bungalow looking out, like maybe with some suspicion himself, like he doesn't know if he can trust Harold or Taxi. They don't know none of them knows what's going on anymore. So yeah, really great illustrations, great characters, great plot, So that is why I put Holiday Inn at number 3 and give it a 9.0 out of 10. Okay, so number 2 is, of course, Return to Holiday Inn. It's superior to the first Holiday Inn, pretty much for the same reason why Bunnicula Strikes Again is a little bit superior to the very first Bunnicula book, as kind of like a direct sequel. It's just the original done better. I think the cast of characters in Return to Holiday Inn was just as good, if not better, than the original, even more interesting. The situation at stake was actually even more intriguing, albeit probably silly. And just as I think I mentioned at the beginning to the Let's Read series for Return to Holiday Inn, I mentioned that it just seemed to have more of a feel of epicness, adventure, especially since in the last part, after we realize what's really going on at Chateau Bow Wow, this is really more about saving Hamlet, a particular character, actually in a way, no, from death, since it was possible he was going to have to be put to sleep eventually by Dr. Greenbrier when he could not take care of him anymore, as Hamlet was unwillingly abandoned by his original owner. But the original plot about how there was, it might seem kind of silly, about the dead terrier Rosebud trying to warn the remaining guests of Chateau Bow Wow about some great evil force that might get them before, if they don't find a means of escape, it might get them. She just called it the secret of Chateau Bow Wow. Might sound kind of lame, but again, it's just the way James Howe managed to write something that might seem childish or silly or lame or extremely simple. So, let's get on with the characters first. There is Hamlet, probably my favorite character, has a really kind of tragic backstory. And you kind of learn the fact that you learn he's actually the mastermind behind everything, but he has sympathetic motivations. He's just trying to convince everyone to find a way out of Chateau Bow Wow so that he can escape and find his original owner, Archie, who, again, was almost forced to abandon him. He couldn't afford to take care of him anymore. Archie ended up having to go into a nursing home. That was just really good. You really can't help but feel for Hamlet, especially during Chapter 8 when everything is explained, that there's not really any kind of evil force in Chateau Bow Wow, though considering the experiences Chester Harold and Howie have had there before, I really can't blame them for believing that there was something like that. It would just seem so appropriate if there actually was like a gateway to hell in Chateau Bow Wow. But, yeah, as Hamlet explains it, in Chapter 8, there was really nothing like that. It was all kind of a setup by him, and you can't help but pity the guy. His reasons for putting forth that hoax. So, that was really well done, how he explained everything. And again, just kind of reading this as a kid, I am seriously imagining the conflict that you thought was there before everything was explained, just this secret of Chateau Bow Wow. It's amazing how James Howe managed to write this in such a way that, again, I was just reading as a child. I'm seriously imagining like there being like it being like Salem's Lot, kinda, that there is some evil force hiding somewhere within that you can't see, that is lying dormant, that might one day, as Chester once said in the original Holiday Inn, erupt with a sudden and terrible force. I'm imagining like some kind of gateway to hell where red-eyed screeching wendigos with claws that could rend you asunder in an instant, or could pour out of the gateway and run amok and kill everybody present. That's just how I'm picturing this. It's really awesome how James Howe writes this and makes it so intriguing, and kind of conveys a sense of horror at the same time. As an adult, yeah, I know very well going in that there's nothing like that going on, and of course there's not going to be anything like that in a kid's book. But that's just the fact that he manages to, with his way of writing, convey it that way. That's great. So, back to the cast of characters. Bob and Linda, felony and misdemeanor, all pretty well done. The Weasel, is kind of an innocent accomplice to felony and misdemeanor who are secondary villains at best. And Ditto, the parrot, she doesn't actually say much, especially for a parrot, and you might think that just, hearing her squawk all day, that it'd be really annoying, but it's not like that. I'm just kind of imagining Ditto as she talks really well. You heard me try to do an impression of a parrot repeating everything she hears in the Let's Reads on Return to Holiday Inn. So, and Dr. Greenbrier, Jill, and newcomer Daisy, pretty much the same as before, and it was totally fine that Harrison wasn't there. Jill just kind of gives a quick aside to him about, like, when she first meets with Harold, Chester, and Howie again, saying what has become of Harrison. I was fine with the fact that there was just a conclusion in that regard, that if he were to show up at all, they would just give a quick mention about what happened to him after he was brought to justice in Holiday Inn, because he was the culprit there, ultimately. And Daisy, is this kind of like, what's the word? Eccentric and kind of almost like this crazy old Catwoman type. But the way she seems to really love animals and everything, she takes a liking to Howie right away. That was a nice little addition. I did like the fact that they tried to replace Harrison with somebody else, and Daisy did just fine in that regard. And there's also Dr. Greenbrier. The man is... It was really good that we kind of had this sense that maybe, just maybe, whatever evil is going on in Chateau Bala, the secret has anything to do with him. That he would be the ultimate, or at least a representation of the ultimate evil force there. I kept thinking that, well, that was totally possible as I was reading through the book for the first time, and of course did not know, what forces were really responsible, what was really at stake here until getting to the end of it, where it left me guessing. Dr. Greenbrier does come across as a rather sinister and enigmatic being. Yeah, you want to think that ultimately he's a harmless, maybe even a good guy, because he was responsible for none of the evil that happened in the first Holiday Inn in the first place. But he does come across as rather irresponsible, that he doesn't try to do anything about the locks on the cages, and still gives off that sense that maybe even he is hiding some ultimately evil intentions. And that if they didn't come to fruition, come to light in the first Holiday Inn, they just might here. Especially when the animals discover him spying on them, so to speak. At least that's how some of the animals, when they had their meeting about what to do about how to escape Chateau Bow Wow, when Dr. Greenbrier just suddenly showed up on the scene, and they're pretty frightened of him. Of course, that's just typical animal paranoia of a veterinarian. But Dr. Greenbrier does still, no matter what, he does still come across as seeming to not really care that much about the animal's well-being. Because, the fact that at the end of Return to Holiday Inn, when they finally go on their adventure after they learn what's really at stake, the fact that they're able to escape the place completely, and not just through digging out under the fence, but the fact that they were actually able to disarm the security system and get out the front door. Obviously, it's like Dr. Greenbrier really does not give a shit about the security and well-being of the animals who board there. But at the end, obviously he does, at least to some degree. He and Jill actually come running after the animals, come tracking them down. And again, it was really great, the fact that at the end, once everything is explained, I really love the last two chapters, where they escape Chateau Bow Wow, but it's not to escape some dreadful evil force, it's to reunite Hamlet with his original owner Archie, and there's a lot of emotion and drama there, especially when Hamlet finally meets Archie face to face, when everything seems so hopeless at the very end in the nursing home. And there's also kind of the fact that all the other guests at Chateau Bow Wow, they're all benevolent too. They're all good guys. There was really nothing Chester, Harold, or Howie had to fear from the others at all. Not even Felony and Misdemeanor, or Georgette, who I kind of thought it was suspicious that she showed up right after Hamlet had to be taken away into Dr. Greenbrier's office, where he couldn't stay in one of the kennels anymore. Everybody, all the other guests were on board with helping Hamlet find Archie, so it turns out they were all really good folk too. So that was, I mean, just a whole lot of factors that altogether make this an enjoyable book that I can read over and over and over, even more so than the other Bunnicula books. And the illustrations, of course, are definitely on par with the original Holiday Inn. Excellent work all around. I can scarcely think of a flaw in any of this. Especially the fact, one last positive I would like to say about Return to Holiday Inn is building up to returning to it. Chateau Bow Wow really sounds like an undesirable place, and after everything that Harold and Chester suffered through the first time, and Howie just now going into this for the first time, there were dark circumstances surrounding Howie's birth there in the first book, so there's really a sense of dread. It's almost like trying to think of a returning heroine in a slasher flick when she has to come back for the sequel when the murders start happening around her again. Just the sense of foreboding. Can I possibly survive this a second time? We were so lucky the first. And I totally get why Chester and Harold, especially Chester, as always, really do not want to go back to Chateau Bow Wow. And the fact that James Howe made a very, very clever reference to the Omen in the first chapter with the fact that they actually found the Omen at 3 a.m. That was really well done. So, all in all, one of the best books I have ever read in my entire life, probably. I give this a 9.5 out of 10, A+. Okay, so, and finally, at number 1, best book in the Bunnicula series, it's actually tied with Return to Holiday Inn, at least as objectively as I can make it. I only put this one in first place because of the added sentimental value. This was my first Bunnicula book I ever read. Thank you again, Grandma, for having just chosen this book by sheer I don't know, just at random, and maybe somehow it was God really does care about the little things in life, that as much as I would come to love these books, he actually somehow moved my grandmother to find this book and pick it out for me, to bring to me as a gift. It was one of her first visits ever since I moved away from Chattanooga, where most of my mother's family still lives, and especially my grandparents at the time. And especially as a 7-year-old, that was not easy to do. So I was really missing being around my grandparents, especially. And I was now 5 hours away in South Carolina. The fact that she chose that for me as a gift to bring on one of her first visits ever since I had moved away, I mean, that was awesome. But if I don't include that part in, and it's not really a good reason to judge the book for the positive or negative. Objectively, it's pretty much the same as Return to Holiday, and I really could not decide which one was better. But what really brings it out over Return to Holiday Inn, as in Return to Holiday Inn would be in first place instead if it wasn't for this one particular thing about Nighty Nightmare, was the awesome horror story that Chester came up with. And yet, at the same time, you always wonder if it's true, if it was actually true, about Bunnicula's origins. The Transylvanian twins Their mother had a sickness. They sought out help from a wealthy man living in a castle high up on the bluff of Kashavarnishkis, the Transylvanian village where they lived. And from there, it's kind of like an origin story about vampires almost, and Bunnicula in particular. It is such an excellent bedtime story. You could tell to one of your children when they're little, assuming they're not too easily scared, I guess, as you tuck them in for the night. It was just, I just love that story. That's really all I can say about it. And it really added just even more epicness to the series overall. I'm sorry, this song's kind of getting annoying, so let me turn that right quick to the next one at random on the list. So yeah, there's also of course the sentimental value. It's one of the first major books I ever read as a kid that wasn't like a picture book or just something you could easily read at like kindergarten, first grade level. I was somehow trying to read this at second grade level, and yet there are a lot of big words. I mean, you could hear it if you kept up with all the Let's Read videos of all the Bunnicula books. Every now and then, even now, I was still managing to find meaning in something that I had completely passed over before, or just didn't understand the joke reference or whatever it was that James Howe was trying to convey there. So you can imagine what a hard time at 7 years old, just in the second grade, that I was having getting through the book for the first time. It was like getting through my first RPG. Well, maybe not necessarily the first one, that happened to be Final Fantasy VI, but really any RPG I ever play, it's like trying to get through that for the first time. The way I was trying to get through Nighty Nightmare, it took a long time. Of course, I could read it in less than an hour and a half eventually, even when I was still a child. Once I started learning all the words of my grandmother and my other family, who might have been listening in when my grandmother and I were reading through this together for the first time. They were helping me along with the words to pronounce them right. Of course, I definitely had no idea how to pronounce Kashavarnishkis. I had to look that one up. But it really, really great sentimental value, just the memories there. But that's what is so great. This is probably the best example also in all of the Bunnicula books of James Howe managing to write in such a way that is way too complicated in a lot of different moments throughout the story. You know, it's almost impossible for children to be able to know what that is the first time, how to pronounce that word, but it still engages them. It's like a challenge you want. That is really daunting, almost like in video games, but it's not so it almost seems unfair, but it's not so terribly unfair that it completely deters you from wanting to pursue it. No, I just wanted to keep reading. Even the parts I couldn't understand, I would just blow through them and maybe come back to that at a later time when I reread it. It kept me engaged enough where that did not deter me, all the difficult parts. And so, really, I don't know if this is necessarily the best cast. I was trying to say best and cast at the same time. Sorry, the best cast of characters, but they were all definitely great. This is not the first time you see Howie, but you really kind of start to build up to his character, I think, better than you did in The Celery Stalks at Midnight, about how impressionable he is and how he manages to handle any kind of real life situation, complicated or adult. I mean, I really don't know how else to say that. Being lost in the woods along with Harold Chester and Dog. He looks to Dog as a possible kind of leader or role model, and where he can't really look to Chester or Harold. Dog knows this kind of stuff better than Harold and Chester would. Harold and Chester, for all their adventures, are basically homebodies. But Dog and his owners, Bud and Spud, you know, they say they camp out in the woods a lot, so Dog kind of knows his way around these parts. It turns out he did all along. He wasn't willing to let on to Chester and Harold that, oh yeah, I mean, I think I do know the way back to camp. I can just, put my tracking skills to good use, but I wanted to show you our house first. That might seem really silly, but I like the fact that Dog was so... He has a lot of street smarts, but he's a moron at the same time in a lot of ways. Even to assuage Harold, Chester, and Howie's fears about being lost in the woods. I mean, he's not even willing to tell them, yeah, I'm pretty sure I can get us back. I just wanted you to see this first. He kind of actually played dumb, And Bud and Spud, especially as an adult reading through Nighty Nightmare again, I really like how Bud and Spud are actually played off to be... They might actually be psychopaths. Just kind of like hillbillies in the woods that will prey upon any unsuspecting greenhorn family. Especially such a nice family as the Monroes and their pets. They would be the kind of people that would prey upon them immediately. Think nothing of it. I kept thinking of them as as like the family from Wrong Turn, albeit probably with not as much inbreeding going on. But it was great that, again, in the end, Bud, Spud, and Dog turn out to be kind of the heroes of the whole story. Dog led them back safely to camp, and then when they realized they were missing, he said, okay, enough playing around. I'm pretty sure I know where they are, so let me get you there. And reunites them with the Monroes. And the fact that Bud and Spud, when the weather got bad and it was impossible to stay outside any longer while the pets were away, actually they were actually kindly enough to let the Monroes stay with them in their house, even though they seem like, even if it did turn out that they were kind people, they definitely seemed introverted and antisocial. But I think it took a lot for them to actually take the Monroes in, and didn't even seem to have any kind of reservations about it, and along with their mother, who, I like the fact that Chester mistook Bud and Spud at first for the Hans and Franz, the protagonist kind of turned antagonist by the end of the story that he told. The Transylvanian twins who were looking for Bunnicula, and their mother, of course, would end up being Erda, the housekeeper, who also survived along with them, whereas Dr. Diabolicus, the father figure, didn't make it. I don't know, all around, again, since it's on the same level as Return to Holiday Inn, definitely one of the best, if not the best, books from my childhood, and probably even today out of any book I've ever read. One of the best. And I especially love the fact that the way it ended, where again, it's amazing how much of an impact Bunnicula has as a character, even in books where he's not even present. In Nighty Nightmare, he was not only simply just mentioned, like not actually there for the conflict, the plot of the story, but he wasn't even there. He didn't even have like a brief appearance before the plot got underway, like in The Celery Stalks at Midnight. Well, no, I take that back. Even in The Celery Stalks at Midnight, he didn't show up at first. He just showed up towards the end. But in Holiday Inn, I guess, in Return to Holiday Inn. But with Nighty Nightmare, he just gets brought up, and it's amazing how much of an impact he still has. That it's almost like you could, from Chester's point of view, you could actually connect Bunnicula, just his generally evil ways as a vampire, with the evil forces. You could almost like hold him responsible for whatever scares, or the evil spirits as Chester calls them, that seem to show up around unseen but always felt and especially heard, which had a lot of impact towards the end of the book, when Harold, Chester, and Howie woke up and found Dowd missing. And Harold was talking about all the night. Well, no, I think all of them had a kind of like collective nightmare about the evil spirits in the woods. Ultimately, yeah, it was thanks to Chester's paranoia and suspicions, but it was great how I don't know, I could actually connect Bunnicula to that. Like, he is somehow ultimately responsible for all this. And of course the fact that the story Chester told to everyone as they were settling down to sleep that night, you know, was all about Bunnicula too. But towards the end, when everything is resolved, I think it was a really good way, just the last few moments of the book, where the Monroes and Bud and Spud and their mother, I'm sorry, I can't even remember, can't remember her name if she even was given one, but how they're singing that campfire song, Someone's in the Kitchen with Dinah, which, you know, that was just fine. It was brought up several times before, so it's not like that was out of nowhere. But how Chester kind of, I guess, as a sense of relief himself that things weren't as bad as they had seen. Bud Spud and their mother, you know, certainly weren't evil people, or Dog. The fact that he twisted the words around of Someone's in the Kitchen with Dinah, but keeping the tune to a song about Bunnicula, is kind of conveying a sense of relief, a happy ending, but that there's still always that fear in the back of Chester's mind, and by extension Harold's and Howie's, because he manages to kind of get them worked up with his fears at the same time. And to you as the reader, that there really is something about Bunnicula, and that even if he was ultimately innocent in all the books before, kind of like with Dr. Greenbrier in the sequel to Halliday Inn, he could always come back. He could always come back with a vengeance, catch you off guard where you thought he was innocent before. No, he was just building up for maybe the very last book in this series or something, where he would be the ultimate antagonist. And of course, lastly, before I wrap this up, I want to give a shout out to the illustrations of Nighty Nightmare. I mean, I don't think they're really like the absolute best, better than everything else, probably tied with the previous two books, but they're phenomenal. I mean, I just love, ever since the first time I read through this book, there were two illustrations in particular I really loved. This first one, towards the end of the book, where Dog is leading Harold, Chester, and Howie on the trail back to his home, belonging to Bud, Spud, and their mother. But Harold, Chester, and Howie don't know that yet. And when Howie finally finds like the end of that trail that was supposedly blood leading all the way from the ruined campsite that the Monroes had abandoned, and they find out it's ketchup, I just love that, you know, how Harold is it's almost like an action shot where you see Harold sort of dodging around the boulder like he's about to, you know, attack what he knows that's the end of the trail. And he's wondering, you know, instead of a ketchup bottle, which that's what it turns out to be, he thinks there might be some kind of devious, you know, creature of evil maybe there, maybe, you know, hiding just around the bend there at the end of the trail, who was responsible for the Monroe's untimely demise, since that was a trail of blood. I like the way Harold just kind of looks like, you know, he's about to pounce on top of it, or at least see what it is, face it before he himself, you know, meets his end. And Howie and Chester just kind of looking over the boulder like, hey man, you sure you want to do that? I don't know, there's a sense of foreboding there in that picture. It's a little bit chilling, but it's also pretty lighthearted. I don't know, just the expressions that Howie and Chester give. And for some reason, I don't think Dog was even there in that picture at all. But you also see like the tree line from the woods in the background, so it's like you can see they're getting close to their ultimate destination, which turns out to be a place of salvation rather than evil end, like Chester was anticipating. But this second picture, this is just great. this wide-eyed, kind of scandalous expression on Chester's face as he's lounging on the tree branch here, and it seems to have a lot of detail to him as well. That's the other thing that makes these illustrations better in Nighty Nightmare in the previous couple of books, as opposed to something like Bunnicula meets Edgar Allan Crow. There's just not that much detail to the animals. They kind of look silly, and you've probably seen in other random pictures that I've scattered throughout this video, just, you know, to kind of have something to look at while you listen to me ramble on. there is a lot of other spin-offs and stuff of Bunnicula where the illustrations are just done so, I don't know. I guess it's not, none of the illustrators there are the same ones as the original Bunnicula books, so I can't really fault them for that. But they just can't really, they definitely don't have the touch for it. There's really no detail to these characters whatsoever in those random illustrations I'm talking about that you might have seen, that you might have noticed before. But here, there is so much detail in Chester's expression. It says so much about him once you come to know his personality and character after reading through all of these books. It almost seems perfect that he's here before the conflict really gets underway. It's like Chester knows it's coming, and he's looking at you. Or I guess in that picture, it's supposed to be that he's looking more at Harold, Howie, and Dog around him as they're talking, as they're having a conversation. And Chester's got his suspicions of Dog, and kind of on one hand with good reason. I mean, Spud and Dog come off as pretty creepy at first, as we've discussed before. But it's like that expression makes it so that I think if this were anything like Fright Night, Chester would do really well as the Charlie Brewster or the Peter Vincent of the story. He's kind of like a veteran of horror, but he's easily suspicious and becomes like kind of worry and frightful of the evil that he sees kind of incoming into his life. But he's also kind of a veteran of it. You almost wonder at the same time, he's telling you with a wink and a nod, yeah, I've dealt with this shit before, but what can I do? I'm gonna master it, not let the horror master me. So, and I've always said that about the particular expression. What's so great about the disc illustration of Claire Redfield on Resident Evil 2, which you see right here for a brief moment, just so I can show you, what I'm talking about. But those are just my impressions. All in all, 99 Nightmare gets a 9.5 out of 10, A+, one of the best books I've ever read. So, that's in the number 1 spot. That's all 7 Bunnicula books for you. And again, thank you everyone who wanted to re-explore this series with me. It's, again, as many times as I've read them over and over in my life, even as an adult, I always manage to find something new that I haven't discovered before, some hidden meaning. And I thank you all for being willing to go through all these Let's Reads with me. I really hope you enjoyed them. And probably next time I will get into another series of books from my childhood. Weren't as important to me, but were still really good. The Beverly Cleary books about Henry, Beezus, and Ramona. And eventually maybe branch off into more adult books. I especially think I can think of some Dragonlance books, for one, off the top of my head. Pretty big fan of those. That would be really, really, really long reads and a lot of work to get through, but would definitely work for read-alouds on YouTube. Again, thank you everybody for listening in, and my core audience in particular. This is Sarah's Night, and I will see you next time.